you're missing half the discussion about how we make for a better society without understanding how class impacts how our society functions. The concept of luxury beliefs is a belief that makes you sound very progressive, but because of your class background or your wealth status, you are insulated from the harms of.
The dupes and the fakes of the world are so good now and so much more readily accessible. And also, a lot of couture houses do most of their construction overseas, and then they stitch a label on it in Italy, and it's called made in Italy. You know what I mean? Large organizations like Monsanto, which is what unfortunately happens to a lot of American farms now, which is basically a giant hedge fund, is running your food sourcing.
It's not so funny. As soon as you said clothes making, I was like, if you say to somebody, "Oh, I make my own clothes," they'll assume you're posh. Because what you say about time.
Yeah. How would you have the time to do that?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And we went from farming to Balenciaga. It was incredible.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Christina Rhodes.
And I'm Tempest Rose.
We are two millennial women 4 decades in.
We're revisiting the culture that made us with a little more hindsight.
And a lot less bullshit.
We've made our own rules.
Built our own spotlights.
And we're here to speak our minds without playing dumb.
And without playing nice.
I am so excited about today's topic, but it might be one of the most meaty. No, pornography was meaty.
Yeah.
Adulting was meaty. Maybe we will definitely be in real time with our ideas today.
Yeah. I would say also my approach to today is going to probably start a little bit more personal. And I feel like a lot of what I was doing was just sort of reflecting on my own experience. I think there's so much we could go into with this topic that there may be future episodes as little offshoots about it.
Yeah, definitely. So we chose to talk about class today. And I'm also excited because you are American.
I sure am.
I grew up in Britain. And we are so close, yet so far apart in the way that we talk about class. And I also chose it because I feel, did I thrust this topic upon you?
I was just thinking, did you choose it?
I said it, and then I thought, maybe I didn't. And then I thought, oh no, have I made Christina talk about this really dense topic that maybe is more obsessional for me than for her? That could be not true. I don't know.
I think it's interesting. I mean, it's interesting, right? It still is. I think perhaps you have a deeper fascination with it, but I still find it interesting.
When we talk about millennial culture, the reason that class, I think, came up when we were talking about different subjects for me was because when I was young, class was something that we talked about all the time. And it was a really big part of sort of the analysis of society. And then that all just seemed to vanish into thin air. And then for 15 years, nobody has talked about class. And I find this very fascinating. And I wonder if for our younger listeners will find this conversation very odd because it's not something that has been swirling around them, whereas it was literally on every news program, every newspaper, every discussion about what was happening in parts of society all went through the lens of class.
Do you think that's because the monarchy and the aristocracy held more sway when we were growing up? Or do you think there's something else at play?
We're going to get into it. So class in the UK and class in America are very different.
Very different.
And I think we should start by discussing what we mean by class, because I think people are confused by that as well. Class is not just about money in the UK. And originally, money was sort of a byproduct of class. But in the States, what does class mean?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly can't speak for all Americans, but I think one of the differences is being somebody who's also spent a lot of time kind of going between the countries since a young age. I always saw class in the UK as, not necessarily being connected to money. It was more about your social standing. And so maybe social mobility might be more difficult, but, you could be totally broke, but you could still be a lord, right? That's necessarily. Yeah. Versus obviously America being a younger country and also America being really, and Americans being really rooted in this concept of the American dream, which is all about social mobility and the fact that technically, any American should be able to be born with any level of wealth or social standing and should be able to become the president or rise to become a billionaire or, so become, the next Rockefeller, become very respected in society. But even within that, it's much more tied to money and to how much money you have, because you don't have the sort of history of social standing in the same way. Now, that said, I spent some of my youth growing up on the East Coast, where there's like an invented sense of old money versus new money, which I found, or certainly like British friends found really amusing. And I think in parallel to British life, it is ridiculous because we're talking about like 100 years. So I think in America, I would consider class is predominantly around how much money you have, how much wealth you have, and what social standing you have. And I think within the social standing, there's also something around a kind of class, which I think you will be going more into, around kind of signifiers, around being part of the cultural elite, which is a class which maybe didn't exist 20 years ago.
Yeah. I think America, from my outsider's perception, one of the lovely things about America is that you have more class mobility. So whilst obviously you still have this huge like gap between the richest and the poorest, and that's exactly the same here. And we had a little look before. The rich have gotten richer, and people in the middle's wages have generally stagnated, and more people are below the poverty line in the UK. I would imagine something similar has happened in America.
Yeah.
But you do still have this ability much more easily, I think, to move between the different levels of society in the States. And actually, like you say, it's applauded. It's something that's celebrated. If you started from nothing and you ended up really wealthy, people on the whole, correct me if I'm wrong, would think of that as like a really great achievement. Whereas because class isn't tied to money in the UK, you could come from nothing, become the richest person in the land, and people will be like, yeah, but they're still working class. Like they're still, they're still trash.
Yeah.
To be clear, I don't think working class people are trash, but people's sense of kind of who was more important than the social hierarchy was not influenced by how much money they had. And actually certain groups of people would look down more on somebody who had come from a less affluent background and had made money, and they would still hold their background against them. Because in the UK, you had this thing, you could never change your class, no matter how much money you made, no matter how you moved into like the more echelons of society, you should still be the class that you were born with. And although we talk about class less, I don't think that's gone away. So I suppose the language to look down on people is different now. I don't know if you still think people look down on people. But yeah, in that way, you don't have that same social mobility. We don't tend to like people who
upstarts.
Yeah, there we go. We don't like upstarts in this country, which is a shame.
Yeah. I mean, I think also in the US, I think there's still like very exclusionary behaviors, but they are maybe easier to adopt. So nowadays you can buy the right clothes, you can go on vacation to the right places. There's things which you can do to sort of ingratiate yourself a little bit more in this kind of group of people, versus in the UK, it's my understanding, you also have things like, by the way that somebody speaks, you can tell what class they were raised in or like born into, or where they went to school. Where they went to school is also a big signifier that maybe just because 350 plus million Americans, it's less of a thing. And also maybe things like an ancestral home. These are not things which are American by nature. So,
Yeah. So class came from exactly like whether you were titled, whether you owned land, therefore where you were educated, like say your manners, your etiquette were class signifiers, how you spoke. And again, like people maybe would hope to change their children's class or their grandchildren through marriage. That's another thing. That's why aristocratic and wealthy women were such, bless them. They really were traded for, the children that they would bring and the class elevation that they would bring. So if you were a man who wanted his children to be of a higher class than you have to marry and have children with a woman who is of higher class than you. You would not be accepted if you were to marry a woman of your own background. Even, again, if you moved into, sent your kids then to boarding school, who you were as their parents traditionally would still be held against them. It wasn't that they were accepted all of a sudden in this new class. For example, if a lord decided in the 70s that he was going to leave his boarding school, quit, go and move to a mining town and work down the pits until the day he died, he would still be upper class. And people confuse people's jobs as well, I think, with classes. Oh, you work, so you're working class. No, that's not what that meant. And in fact, some of the aristocracy did work. It didn't change their class. What your job is might be a class signifier, but it does not define your class. And that must seem confusing. I think it's confusing to a lot of British people as well. So much of how you know what someone's class is so subconsciously leached into you. I even find it quite hard to explain.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I'd be curious to sort of chat to my partner because his mother was born to like a higher class background, but his father grew up in very working class Birmingham and happened to go to a grammar school, and then from there became a successful business person. And then he sent his children to rugby, and and then from there Pip comes across as very upper class, but in fact he's only one generation away from working class, but he has a cute little posh accent, and
he does, and the kind of adorable floppy hair that I associate with people from that background.
But no, I mean, it's totally foreign to I think to Americans, because it just goes against the grain of what being an American is that you were raised from like day one that you should be able to be whoever you want to be and define yourself as an American. And that is not the game.
That is
here.
not the way we do it in the UK.
Which I actually think on a personal note, there's nothing to do with class. I've always enjoyed about being an American in the UK because I just feel like people don't really know what to do with you if you're like a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed American who just like bulldozes in with whatever you want to do. I think sometimes they just sort of let you do it because they don't. It's just so foreign and like confusing.
And you're also peppy and enthusiastic as well. And that's nice, if strange to us Brits.
Correct.
I feel like when you talk about class, people get uncomfortable because they think that talking about something is an endorsement of it. And it's probably just good to get that straight off the back here.
Sure.
I'm not interested in class because I feel like everyone needs to know what class they're from. And then we all need to stay in our zones and suffer the consequences of however you accidentally fell by your birth, what your position in society was, because that's the unfairness of class, is that you cannot change your class, or again, not here. But the reason I find it fascinating is because I don't think it's possible to have a frank analysis and to therefore move towards a better equality without understanding how class impacts how our society functions. And so I suppose that's what I find a bit disturbing about the fact that class just vanished into this vacuum with every analysis I ever come across. I don't even know how much things like class feature in DEI policies, minimally, I'm going to guess. And I really loved Akala's book, Natives, which I really recommend if you've not read it. When did it come out? It probably came out, I'm going to guess, about 10 or so years ago. And he talked about how race and class intersects in the UK. And again, I just think you're missing half the discussion about how we make for a better society if you cannot factor in a huge pressure that exists on people and where you come from and where you're born. And given that DEI is something that's definitely being talked about a lot, whether you're pro it, whether you're against it, whether you have criticisms of it, whether you think it's the best thing since sliced bread. Again, in the UK, every country is different, but you cannot have this analysis. And so I'll give you an example. One of the critiques they found of DEI is that whilst, yes, within companies, for example, they try to promote more LGBTQ plus people, more women, when they actually looked at the backgrounds of where those people came from, they might have fallen into those identity umbrellas, but they were all from the same elite class background. So you've sort of re-privileged a arguably reasonably privileged section of society. And I would argue that doesn't move us towards greater equality. That is one of the problems of forgetting class.
So where do you think it went? Like when the conversation just vanished into thin air? Why do you think that is?
Well, I'm going to take my sparkly tinfoil hat out. And I really wonder. So when we were discussing this, we came across like, do we have a new class, essentially? And I think that we don't necessarily have a new class, but we have an offshoot of the middle class. Now, for context, I guess, what is the middle class? Originally, the structure of society was you had the land-owning aristocracy, and then you had the people that worked on the land. And obviously aristocracy, royalty, this is our, 200 years ago, 300 years ago. Then as we discovered capitalism and trade, you had working class people and the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
Thanks, you're nodding. That's a very important part of this is the Industrial Revolution. Through this completely new technology. And we went from farming to Balenciaga. It was incredible. You moved from an agrarian, a farming-based society, a land-owning society, into an industrial society. And that total introduction of a never-before-seen technology allowed people to make wealth in a way that hadn't been done before. And then you, of course, have the invention of the limited company. You have business. When we started internationally trading, you create a middle class, which is people who aren't aristocracy, but who have made money. And one of the sort of signifiers of the middle class is that a lot of drama is made of the middle class constantly wanting to elevate their status through class signifiers, which I guess is why the aristocracy then invented this concept of new money to be like, they might have wealth, but they are not of our class.
But what about Downton Abbey when all the poor lords needed to marry rich Americans?
Exactly, because they needed the money. Totally. Yes. So the aristocracy ran out of money. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And needed an injection of cash. I suppose marrying into American money was, I don't know, would it have had a sheen of international intrigue in a way that marrying into the British middle class would not have had this layer of glamour, America being this new country that was all snazzy and glittering.
Yeah. I'm going to guess also an American princess's coffers would be slightly fuller than even a wealthy middle-class British person.
Yeah. I guess America really is a country of the Industrial Revolution, isn't it?
I mean, huge wealth. Yeah.
So within the middle class, would it be fair to say, which is a group of people who are defined very much by the jobs and the professions that they do, because this is how they gained their status, not through hereditary titles, but through work and reputation. We can definitely get a terrible reputation as the middle class. I wonder if we have a new section of the middle class due to technology, is one. Some people call this the cultural class. Let's use that term because I feel it's not loaded. People are sort of trying to name this group of people, and some of, I think, the terms that they use are things that people just haven't heard of, so it doesn't really make any sense, or also maybe signifiers that some people don't like. So what I call it, the cultural class is a fairly benign descriptor. Let's call it the cultural class. So you have this section of the middle class that informs the culture. So civil service, the charity, the very established charity sector. When I say charities, I don't mean your grassroots, people who are just genuinely trying to make people's lives better. I'm talking about large charities who function like corporations, who people at the top of these charities are on huge salaries often, and they influence the culture, the political class, the technical class, and the artistic class. I feel like this is where you and I have some kind of direct experience, and journalism. So people who make the films, make the TV shows, write the newspapers, and that is the establishment when it comes to culture. And I know from experience, and I'm sure I've been one of them, especially in the arts, you sort of feel like you're counterculture. But you're not really, because you're making all the media and all the Netflix shows that everybody consumes and gets to sort of sway the cultural discourse. And getting to my tinfoil hat moment, I wonder if this is an ever-changing field of study, it was not in those people's interest to talk about class because they were not working class. And it's always been a big feature of the middle class to kind of pretend that they were poorer than they were, whilst also wanting to socially climb higher because they felt that they were better. If I say Hyacinth Bouquet into the microphone, every millennial and Gen X will presumably know what I mean. So it's this weird pull of like, I want to fit in and make out that I'm one of the people, but actually I do sort of deep down feel like I'm better than everybody else.
Yeah, completely. I mean, I think it's interesting because as you were talking about it, I would sort of, again, as an American, I consider the Zuckerbergs and the tech elite and the cultural elite. Certainly, a lot of journalists don't get paid a huge amount of money, so therefore also would need to supplement their incomes or just have disposable income already. Not always the case, but sometimes. But I would just think of that as the upper class of America. But it's interesting that here there's like an existing upper class that cannot be disrupted. Or can it? Like, is this just the new upper class of the UK as well? Or do you think that in British people's minds, the upper class is still entrenched and cannot be, that this is an other?
It's an other. For me, I think it's the new dominant class.
Yeah.
Because I don't think the upper class is now the dominant class in the way that previously, of course, the lords and the ladies and the barons were the most important people. And I read a really interesting thing that said, the royal family used to be really hated. Like, you get the kind of class warfare in the 60s, 70s and 80s here. And the royal family really represents everything that is wrong with the dominant class. That's dominant class. But I feel now, particularly with the Queen, who sadly is no longer with us, and I really miss having a woman as the head of state. I just didn't realize how nice that was until she was no longer around. The aristocracy really isn't the dominant class anymore. The cultural class is, and the political class I've included in the cultural class, but also tech, private industry, all of this dark money funding, lobbying, private capital, hedge funds. This is all really a middle class thing. And so as people have come to hate the quote unquote 1%, we can get into that, the billionaire class, and consider them the root of all society's ills. Is this why we have obsessions with things like Downton now?
Yeah,
Because we're like, oh, actually, yeah, let's all feel comforted watching Downton Abbey.
I don't know. I mean, I think obviously I can only really speak for myself, but I think, again, as an American who, whether it's true or not, and I think arguably it's really not true, you have the concept of America being a meritocracy. And so the concept that you could be that you are born into something that inherently makes you superior is very anti-American. Yeah. Even if it seeps into culture and you still, certainly, billionaire and multimillionaire children in America, I've met plenty of them who were born with a sense of superiority. The inherent context of like being an American is that, you should be able to travel through the classes, and that's not a thing. And with hard work, you should be able to get anywhere you want to. So yeah, they just seem irrelevant. Basically, I don't care that you're a lord. It's like some cute little title that you could buy.
Well, you could buy.
Not my current bank
account. But yes, they do sort of seem a bit quaint and irrelevant now.
Of course they're irrelevant. Who cares what some like rando who cares what some like rando lord or baron or lady thinks about anything?
It's so interesting. Yes, I understand why you say that. And again, I think I want to be careful, but this is a very British thing, because whilst it is true that in terms of, again, government lobbying, where real money goes and what gets funded, they are sort of a little bit irrelevant. But in the UK, they're still the major landowning class.
So I take some of that back. It's relevant if somebody is a major landowner and they have major opinions over that land which they own or the tenants which they have, that kind of relationship, then sure, of course, like that's a completely different thing. And I'd be curious to listen to what they have to say about that particular thing, which, all of that makes sense, right? But I don't care about what a lord or lady or baron or baronet thinks about anything else. Do you know what I mean? Like,
because you think they have less power?
Do I think they have less power now?
Like, is that why you don't care?
I think they have less social power than they did.
Yeah, I agree.
I think
that's a good word for it, I think.
Yeah, because again, like the more dominant, if you are attracted to power, as many people are, then yeah, they're not the dominant class anymore. So they're not as attractive.
Yeah.
And therefore they're not as relevant.
I'm everyone's fascinated with American politics. It's like a soap opera none of us wanted, but we're all addicted to. In the last election, it was so interesting to me that the Republicans, free Trump, because Trump just seems to define the Republicans now, managed to position themselves as the working classes people's party. And whether you agree with that or not, I mean, the polling kind of bore that out. Yeah, the stats on voting.
Yes.
Which again, for me, is another sort of signify that we're onto the right thing with the kind of the new dominant class, because the Democrats are not the party of the people. Correct me if I'm wrong again. I'm not American. I know you've lived here for ages, but you still have family in the States and friends there. When I think of the Democratic Party, I think years ago I would have thought Republicans, rich people. Democrats, artsy, lefty, of the people. And this is so not true now.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's obviously a complicated issue with a lot of like strands that we could go down. But I think certainly conceptually, the Democrats no longer seem to stand to your average American for the like working class.
Yeah.
Whether or not they do, whether or not the Republicans do is a whole other kettle of fish. But certainly like perception wise, the Democrats represent the dominant class, and that's what's perceived as those are their interests. And the Republicans are perceived to have the interests of the uber wealthy and the uber working class at heart, which is an interesting juxtaposition.
Yeah.
But and how they managed to wrangle that, fuck knows.
It's so clever of them. Like, let's take like how we feel personally about it out of it. That's so damn clever.
Yeah, of course it is. Yeah. And it's what won them the election. So there's a huge amount to sort of like dissect inside of that, but perception-wise, I would say that is correct.
Yeah. I think it's definitely true to say that, I mean, we're straying into politics, but in class politics, it's because in the UK, you used to have this thing, Labour were the party of the working class. Again, going back to the 80s, the 70s, and the Conservatives were the party of the upper class. And I don't think the Conservatives are the party of anybody now. I'm sure even my diehard Conservative voting father thinks the last government are all a bunch of morons. That's probably maybe the only thing that unites the country is a complete disgust at our last government and their behaviour. But it's definitely not true either anymore that the Labour Party represents your average working people. And I, not being a political expert myself, but I don't think I'm saying anything completely off the wall by saying since Blair, the Labour Party has moved much more towards a party of what we are calling the dominant class or the middle class or the sort of metropolitan class, you know, those of us in cities like London, than their roots of average working class person.
Yeah. What was I mean, I don't know if we want to go down such a political road, but it's been interesting again, sort of as an American, seeing the current Labour government's like seemingly plan to destroy British farmers because you would think that farming and local farming, you know, and not being sort of run by large organizations like Monsanto, which is what unfortunately happens to a lot of American farms now, which is basically like a giant hedge fund is running your food sourcing. You would think that the local version is preferable, but what I've been told, and maybe you can illuminate me more, is that there's a concept that farmers are part of the bourgeoisie and they're part of the landed gentry and therefore are not of the people.
Yes. It's such an interesting one you've brought up because it also exposes here, I think, there's the world how it is, but we're still living in the definitions of groups of people that we carry from when we're younger. And so, yeah, farming is definitely part of that because you are right. I think farmers traditionally farmers aren't bourgeoisie, but they, I guess, originally would have been, landed gentry, like you say, and farming, owning lots of land, producing wealth. Yeah, it's a tough one though, because you do sort of like, you know, your friendly farmer down the road where you get your eggs and your chickens. I'm not sure people realize the extent to which, and I didn't until I started listening to people talk about this sort of labor attack on farmers, that the alternative is giant corporations full of hedge funds and dark money run our food source. And that fills me with horror.
Yeah.
And it seems absolutely wild to me that our Labour government would support something like that. But again, is this a little bit like the Democratic Party? Like, we are used to thinking of these groups as far more representative of the people and carrying an inherent goodness. And that's really crumbled now, certainly amongst regular people. I think in the cultural class, people are still clinging on to this idea of the inherent moral goodness of what we would have thought of as our more left-wing parties. But I would guess that they are much more enthralled to kind of global international corporatism than perhaps our conservative class, who tend to be a bit more about preserving the national identity and national industry. That's very simplistic. So, yeah, I say it, but I'm not wed to it.
I guess I'm curious, while you were talking, just wondering about whether or not, sort of being with this idea that, we're still sort of attached to concepts we had that when we were growing up. I'd be so curious to know from somebody who's a little bit younger, whether they feel, particularly if they were kind of, growing up when this conversation of class seemed to start to disappear, how tied people in the UK feel to a class now.
Yeah. Please let us know.
Oh, yeah.
I would hazard a bet that most people from the cultural class are labouring under the suspicion that they are working class. And I recognise, I had it re-shown to me through COVID, how insular we all are. So I don't know how much people who aren't from the UK know, but London has this really interesting, I think, social mixing due to the way that its architecture works. Because of the Blitz, for example, when places got bombed, the government or the local council would build blocks of flats on them. And then in the 50s, 60s and 70s, I live in one of these blocks, this would often become council houses. And so you have this sort of forced mixing almost of groups of people from different class backgrounds. So it's the case in London that even in the wealthiest areas, you will still have council blocks. And then obviously we have a lot of people in London, so it's very difficult to kind of totally isolate yourself. When I first moved to London, I moved to Belsize Park. There's huge amounts of wealth in Hampstead and Belsize Park. I lived opposite a massive council estate. There was another one up the road. And so it's much harder to isolate yourself from people who might have a completely different kind of economic background to you. And a lot of those council houses then got sold on. This is during Thatcher. You got the opportunity to buy your council house. And although that gets looked back on negatively because then those council houses weren't really replaced, so now we have a shortage of social housing, that's also because we have a much bigger population now than we did then. That was a huge piece of social mobility that happened. So people who were living in council houses, working class people, suddenly were able to become property owners. When I say easily, that sounds flippantly, but far more easily than had that scheme not been in place. And that actually had a massive impact on social mobility in this country that doesn't really get recognized because, for obvious reasons, people aren't super keen to think of great things about the Thatcher period. So in London, because a lot of these properties then got bought, they got resold or they got rented out. So you end up in the situation that I live in, for example, where I live in a block that is half council and half private. And property prices in London mean that the private properties are expensive. And so during COVID, when we were all forced to stay at home, I got to know my neighbours really well, far more so, because again, none of us talked to our neighbours than I would have done previously. And it was such an eye-opening reminder to me that you can literally live next door to each other, but on completely different planets. And your experience of life, your perceptions with how you interact with the establishment, like even just how some of my neighbours absorbed guidance for COVID to how me and my friends were absorbing it. You're literally on different planets.
I find it interesting because it's so, so different than America. Because again, in America, you have this concept of social mobility being like an inherent right. And also that, your house is your castle, right? So you should be able to buy a piece of land. You should be able to do whatever you want to it. So none of this
leasehold.
I mean, I was just going to say the sort of regulations on building controls, but yeah, the leasehold thing is like totally mind-blowing if you're an American. For those of you who are not British, when you buy a property in the UK, you don't normally buy just the property. You don't always buy just the property, and particularly in London, you buy the right to live there for like 100 years, isn't it normally?
Oh,
Like
you're basically
99
doing
years?
glorified renting.
Yeah, it's mad. Like to an
Well,
American, it's
because-
totally mind-blowing.
I mean, it's completely ridiculous. But I suppose coming back to our early point, that is because the person who owns the land retains the right to hold it in perpetuity, which stops people from getting
Ahead of themselves.
Yes. Yeah, basically, and handing on property to their children.
And I do know, it's my understanding that the sort of acquiring property, especially for families in London, is like a big part of helping your children go up a ladder, like go up a notch in the class ladder, that you suddenly, like, if you help buy your kids some a property, and then they're able to buy another property, and then suddenly you're like property owners, and then you're, amassing more wealth. And again, that's not how most Americans amass wealth, by buying properties and then renting them out. Not at all. I don't know anybody who does that versus...
Oh, really?
Yeah, at all.
Okay.
But also very un-American is the concept of having two classes or two wealth backgrounds, which in America, they're much more closely linked, together. Like America is the home of gated communities, and, I mean, I love London for that reason. I love, like, even... I feel like it exists less now than it did 20 years ago, pre kind of smartphones, but the pub culture, right? Where there's this concept, at least. So you'd have like a whole hodgepodge of people all sat having a drink, arguably together, right? Like whether or not you're like actually conversing together is another thing, but you're all in the same chosen environment. Versus in America, again, it's just like, as you change class or wealth stratospheres, you are absolutely... do not want to be associated. You have the living on the wrong side of the tracks. It's like such a, concept in America that you're part of a different and other and external group.
Yeah. That makes so much sense. I don't know then if it's extra impressive that people in the UK can still live in their own class bubbles. Yeah, I think that's how I got into class property, because it's very common for people in the middle class, again, to sort of feel that they're working class because they don't spend any time, I feel, with actual working class people. And this exists a lot, I think, in the, what do we call it, the cultural class. Being an artist, I spend a lot of time around people who I know come from very middle class backgrounds, who are university educated, but who conduct themselves in the world as if they are poor, or they are, I don't think they would call themselves working class, but they sort of present as the poverty-stricken artists in a way that I find a little gross. I feel like they're cosplaying, and this has gone on forever, they're cosplaying I'm going to choose the word marginalization, even though it's probably not quite the right word to use, that just isn't true.
So I think there's two things about that. One is, I think, yes, it definitely exists. I think also, you see it back in America, you used to see it, you see it a lot less now, with sort of Nepo babies, who, when we were growing up, it was much more like they wanted to pretend like they didn't have the parents that they did, and they were like, oh, that's so boring. Now I feel like they're embracing it a little bit more. But do you think that any of that is also to do with the fact that you live in London? And I know what you're saying, but there is also a real component to that, which is, yes, you are choosing to be an artist, and therefore you are choosing to potentially be impoverished, but also it is really expensive to live in London.
Yes. Yeah, I'm sure that's true. You're sort of getting your perception reinforced by the reality that, London is very expensive and art doesn't tend to pay a lot of money. You make a valid point there.
But it is a choice still. It's not like being an artist was like thrust upon you.
Yes, you weren't born into artistry and therefore had to suffer the deprivation of living in London. Yeah, you chose to go into an industry that notoriously is not wealth driven or not from the majority of the people in it.
Yeah.
I think there's also a sort of badge of honor in being an artist and trying to describe yourself as like one of the people, which is a little infuriating because, one, it's cosplaying a class background or a poverty that actually you don't have. And secondly, I think we need some Americanness, because It's difficult to make money in the arts, of course. I mean, there are lots of industries where it's difficult to make money, but it's not true that it's impossible. And
Sure.
I wonder if this is part of this British, like, don't get above yourself, don't be too arrogant, don't get above your station. Even artists I know who live in a certain amount of prosperity still pretend that they're struggling. And I don't think necessarily it's because they're terrible people who want to pretend that they're poor. I think it's because they're embarrassed and they might feel that it makes them less of an authentic artist, or that other people might look at them as being, I mean, there is a sort of like rich people are bad people. That's another dynamic that goes on here. So people around them would think of them as like bad people or suspicious people. The irony is that a lot of the people looking at them probably also are being quite quiet about the fact that actually they did just buy their own house. And I now know quite a lot of artists who own their own property, and I'm really proud of them for that. And
totally.
I'm proud of myself that I own half of my flat with my husband. When I chose to be a performer, I never thought that that would be a dream that would be realistic for me. And not only have I done it, but I know lots of other performers in cabaret and burlesque, that's my field, who so again, they're not TV presenters, you know what I mean? They're not like
£2,000 an episode.
They haven't just dropped their like million selling album or something, who have gone on to buy property. And I wish actually that was like applaudable because there's also an aspirational quantity to this, isn't it? Like if you show somebody, and again, this is very American and I think it's one of the positives, actually, no, you can get somewhere. You can aspire to live in comfort and create a decent life for yourself. And it is possible. I'm not saying it's easy, but it is possible. Isn't that better?
Totally. And I mean, also, again, the last time I was working in the burlesque and cabaret world was a long time ago. But I remember back then being so bowled over and amazed by the fact that you could be a performer in the UK who could hope to achieve these things, but also who could just earn a living by performing, which in America, certainly in that field back then, was like nigh on impossible. I didn't know anybody besides Dita Von Teese who did that. And still, I'm sure a lot of her work came from, I mean, some of it would have been introduced from her celebrity husband and then her network and then her sponsorships and her relationships and her advertisements and everything else. But I think it's an amazing thing. And it's crazy to me that people still feel it's so interesting that, that class is just so prevalent in a way still, that people like have it in their little head that they, shouldn't be trying to move. Don't put your head above the parapet.
So in this situation that we find ourselves whereby class isn't such a bigger factor as I think it should be when we talk about social mobility and who is getting grants and sponsorships and charitable funding and things like Arts Council funding, I came across the concept of luxury beliefs. Which you and I've talked about. And when I understood this, it opened up a whole new sort of like window in my understanding of the society around me. And so we now live in an age, I think, whereby it's not Downton Abbey.
It's not for most of us.
I know. Which I'm sad about, I'll be honest.
Sad if I was the person who was
yes,
the
if we
wealthy
were. Because I was talking about fashion. Obviously, like we said, I work in burlesque, you've worked in burlesque. If we didn't love fashion and beautiful, shiny things, it would not have been in the industry for us. So when I say I'm sad we don't live in Downton Abbey, I'm looking at the ball gowns and they're getting dressed for dinner and all this sort of opulence and beauty that would have previously only been affordable by very wealthy people. Obviously, working class people weren't walking around in diamonds and furs for dinner. And I think even less so nowadays, you have this concept of what somebody wears if they're wearing designer clothing as a class signifier, because fashion, I think, is much more accessible now.
Well, so I would put a pause in that. So I think what I've noticed is that you have a decline in people caring whether or not you're wearing obviously designer clothing, because also the dupes and the fakes of the world are so good now and so much more readily accessible. And also, a lot of couture houses do most of their construction overseas, and then they like stitch a label on it in Italy, and it's called made in Italy. You know what I mean? So basically, it's much easier to look like you're wearing all the latest obvious fashions. But what I've seen is that then there's this kind of quiet luxury that has developed where you have brands like The Row, where a bag will cost £5,000. But unless you know that exact style, it doesn't have a big logo. It's like really delicately, sort of etched into the leather. Then you wouldn't know that, right?
Yeah.
And so there's these signifiers, but they're much more subtle in a way, but they still exist.
Yes. You are totally right. Yeah. And the whole quiet luxury thing, which is absolutely fascinating. Did you get the whole Burberry phenomenon in the States?
Oh, yeah.
So when Burberry became big here, people who were middle class and above stopped buying it because it was a working class fashion label. So it kind of, in their minds, degraded the prestige of the brand, because all of a sudden people who they did not want to be associated with were walking around in this designer clothing label. Yes, quiet luxury. So I was having this discussion with somebody and she was saying, I know that rich people now look kind of poor, i.e. you're not putting on your finest every time you step out the door in an obvious way. But how did they know the difference between me having no money and the fact, like, how do I, like, what are the signifiers, like you say? And yes, the quiet luxury is what would you even call it? It's like really subtly recognizable labels.
Yeah, I mean, so I would say it's subtly recognizable labels. I think, you brought up a point, we were chatting about this earlier, around grooming. If you can afford to spend 300, 400, 1,000 pounds on your hair once a month, and you go to the salon to get your nails done, and you have more time, because I think time has become the biggest luxury. That's the biggest commodity, right? So if you are really wealthy, you have more time to be able to do whatever you want to do. And that can be working out, that can be taking all your specialty wellness things, that can be doing yoga, that can be going to certain special destinations that only cool people know about who have billions of dollars. Or it can be in making sure that you are investing in your body in a way that somebody who has to work a job or two jobs just will not have the time and energy for.
Yeah, because also a skin, isn't it? Like, how much processed food are you eating? Particularly with kind of luxury wellness as a return to everything's organic, which is more expensive, and not processed food, cutting out refined sugars. Like, these are not things that somebody who has to work 3 jobs has the fucking time to implement over. But also, what kind of environment you grow up in when you're young, what kind of food you get fed, someone's skin, as well as their grooming. As part of the package, can be a luxury signifier. I think, if I'm looking at a woman who's wearing, nothing showy, could even be like the latest tracksuit from Primark, and you want to wonder how you can say what's the difference potentially between her and somebody who, if she comes from an affluent background and somebody maybe who doesn't, then I might say, look at nails, look at what jewelry she's wearing, how is her hair dyed, like what's footwear, like is stuff leather or is it pleather, like all of this kind of stuff. And it is true in the UK to say, like, you get a lot of like regular girls, like makeup culture is massive here, influencer makeup culture, nails. You get people from what we would call more working class backgrounds who invest huge amounts of time into personal grooming. But like with everything, I think there's fashions for how that looks.
Definitely.
And we always replicate the fashion, or most of us replicate the fashion of the people around us. So different trends, like eyelash size to me, can be an indicator of like what pocket of the sort of culture people come from. Is it really big, feathery eyelashes that have a very obvious curl in them? Are they very kind of full but wispy, soft eyelashes?
No, it's so true. But again, I think it's become so much more subtle. So as before, maybe it would just be you either didn't have any money for anything nice, right? You were hand making your clothes, or I mean, even Grace Kelly, her and her mom made her wedding dress, right? But like, it maybe would have been much more extreme now, but it still exists. It's just much much more subtle.
It's not so funny. As soon as you said clothes making, I was like, if you say to somebody, oh, I make my own clothes, they'll assume you're posh.
So
Because
true,
what you say
yeah.
about time.
Yeah. How would you have the time to do that?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So with this quiet luxury, there is the theory of luxury beliefs, i.e. your opinions on certain things have become class signifiers. And when I heard of this theory, it blew my tiny mind, Christina, because it just sort of made sense of something that I was only half understanding and trying to figure out. So this is by an American guy called Rob Henderson, who comes from a mixed heritage background. I think he is mixed race, Mexican and Korean, but Asian definitely, and grew up in extreme poverty in the States. And then he, through a sort of series of life changes, so he was taken into foster care, but then he was eventually adopted. He joined the military because of subsidies given to military vets. You can have money to go to college. He's obviously has a very high natural intelligence because he went to college. Then I think he went to Harvard. Then he went to Oxbridge. So he really traveled in his lifetime through different parts of society. And his theory, through observation, is that as he moved into wealthier and wealthier and more upper class backgrounds, what really was used by these people to signify that they were of the same social class was their opinions. And his theory, which makes a lot of sense to me, but it is someone's theory, is that the concept of luxury beliefs is a belief that makes you sound very progressive, but because of your class background or your wealth status, you are insulated from the harms of. So a luxury belief would be prison abolition. Prison abolition is something that's very touted within kind of academic circles, lots of liberal artsy circles. You know, that police should be defunded, that we should get rid of the prison complex altogether. But actually is not a belief that, this is all very American focused, that more marginalized communities living with more poverty and more non-white communities support at all being the victims more of crime. And what they found post-COVID was because of the fallout of, you know, there's terrible, brutal police killings that we saw of African Americans, really kind of galvanized this movement that, no, like we need to defund the police. We need to restrict kind of funding for the police and what they do and prison sentencing. Crime went up in poorer areas. So people not of these elite groups suffered the fallout of what was an elite luxury belief that because the elite group were in charge of how funding was allocated, the justice system, the sort of institutional level of law and order, they could change these things in society but not suffer the consequences of them. So they supported a belief that they were insulated from the harms of, that actually wasn't a belief that was being put forward by the group of people that they were speaking on behalf of.
It's interesting. I wonder with that specific example, I wonder whether part of that is also that if you are, because I've read some studies on successful adjustments to policing in areas like the projects, which I think maybe you don't have projects in the UK, but like social housing in America in cities can sometimes be called the projects. They're often very dangerous, very isolated. And can, all sorts of harms to children growing up there. But I wonder if it's also that they're isolated from the outcome, but they're also potentially approaching it from a completely separate way. So I think that there's a large racial discrepancy between, 13% of the population is Black in America, but 37% of prisons have Black people inside of them, which is wildly disproportionate. And, there's a huge amount we could go down on that path. But I think as I understand it, there is still support for the concept of changing some of these things. But it's a question of also making sure that the change makes sense. It comes up from a more organic place. So I think, what you're saying, I think makes total sense. I wonder whether or not part of it is also that they're approaching a solution from a very external place. So from a kind of like more esoteric, oh, wouldn't it be nice to like defund the police and they're so mean and cruel, but not so much looking at the fallout if they just do that, right? Which other people will suffer the consequences, but they're also not approaching it from what's going to work for the people that are in these areas and what's going to like actually make it safer and better for them. That probably the solution is probably not just defund the police, but there probably is a solution that could improve the situation, but they're just not approaching it sort of organically.
Yeah. Well, I think this is where you get into the sort of insular nature of class, really, because academia is not a particularly egalitarian pockets of society, nor would I say is academia not only not particularly egalitarian, but also is theory-based. Literally, the whole point of academia is talking about ideas and theories and not really putting them out into the real world. So it's definitely true that you do get, and this is people talk about this a lot at the moment, there has been a lot of theories taught at universities that have had quite a big impact on how we've started to think about society, but are not rooted in the real-life existence of people, but rather what happens when you sit in a room somewhere and talk about hypothetically, wouldn't it be nice if we did this, that, and the other? Academia is important, but I have always felt it has its time and place, and that's probably not deciding how most people should live their lives.
Oh, totally. And also if we do sort of, if it is people inside of academia are a little bit more rooted in luxury belief systems, then it's, they're not grounded in what people actually need.
Yeah. One other reason why luxury beliefs made sense to me is because of how quickly language changes. And I have definitely noticed this in my sphere. And I say this as somebody who wants to try and feel as if I am, in a very small way, making the little pocket of the world around me better or more equal, or, opening up opportunities, perhaps more than exist if we just let things run. How quickly words become out of fashion. And the internet obviously has really fueled this as a means of sort of, the words are everything on the internet. And activism now lives on the internet much more so, well, obviously, than previously because we didn't have it. But you can have a lot of performative activism nowadays in a way that you just didn't exist before, because to do activism, you actually had to go and do something. Now you can write something and share something and feel like you've done a really great job.
Check.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so good. Yes, thank you. And because of that, I have watched in real time over 5 years. Okay, we call this group of people this thing. Okay, now this thing. Okay, now this thing. Okay, now this thing. And then I'm being broad because I've seen this across all different, I'm not just talking about one thing, one example. And often when the language changes, people argue it's to be more inclusive. And it has occurred to me that cannot possibly be true, because unless you have huge amounts of time to spend online in cultural class activist spaces, it is not humanly possible for Jan down the road working 3 jobs to keep up with what a bunch of 20 to 30-year-olds has decided is the correct terminology that day. And so, again, when I heard about luxury beliefs, it really resonated with me, because I thought, this explains why it is not possible, unless you are rooted within a certain group of people and have the time to keep up with what is supposedly inclusive language. And I would argue that the definition of inclusive language is language that everybody understands. And if you need a degree and 4 hours a day on social media and to hang out with your cultural class friends 24 hours a day, then you are not using inclusive language. I thought, well, that's a class signifier then, isn't it?
Yeah, I remember when you told me that also blew my little head, because you're right. It's very interesting.
Isn't it?
What a juicy topic.
I know.
Like we just scratched the surface of it.
Yeah, me too. We should probably wrap up soon. I'm sure we could come back to many elements of this. And if you're listening and it stirred some thoughts in you, please feel free to comment, because it really helps us think, oh gosh, yeah, let's talk more about this section of it. And, we heard this, and that could be where you agree or where you disagree. Or so many of you have told us really interesting stories, kind of one-to-one, about stuff that's happened to you or thoughts that you have. And we absolutely love that. And this is why we started doing this.
Yeah.
There is definitely so much to say more about class, and we'd love to hear from you.
And it's such a personal thing too, because everybody will have a very personal, very specific journey with this, as well as one that's sort of communally shared socially.
Yeah, especially as we moved from class into identity politics. Now everyone feels that they're talking about you personally, which makes it very difficult to change ideas, to not feel personally attacked, I think, when people talk about something that you might feel jars with your experiences, or also, which again is the luxury beliefs thing, isn't it? Like, I believe this thing, therefore I am X, Y, and Z. Whereas I think we believe, ideas should be fluid and changeable.
Malleable.
Yeah.
Challengeable.
Totally. Okay. Hey, thanks so much for listening. We love making this podcast and we really want it to grow. So if you enjoyed listening to us,
please like, subscribe, give us a 5-star rating. Also, feel free to comment, DM us, open up a conversation. The whole point of this podcast is to be in support of having open lines of communication and debate, and we would love to hear from you.
Listen to the sirens.
Woo!